All right. All right. Welcome, everyone, to another GoDaddy Pro Makers of the Web meetup. My name is Marcus Burnett, and it has been about a month or so since our last meetup due to WordCamp US happening. And then, unfortunately, Hurricane Ian came through here, and I live in Central Florida and knocked power out for 4 days. So, had to push that back as well. But we're back now. Hope everyone's had a great week so far. Today I have a special guest joining me to talk about e-commerce accessibility. Bet Hannon is the CEO of Accessicart, and we'll spend some time answering questions that I've gathered about accessibility. How are you today, Bet?
I'm doing well. Well, we're having wildfire smoke today. So you have
Oh,
hurricanes. We have
yeah.
wildfires out here in Oregon. So
Can't escape the natural disasters,
no,
unfortunately. That is not great. We did get a chance to talk some at WordCamp US, and that was awesome. Glad that we
we
got a chance
did.
to meet up there and chat for a bit. Um, no, minus wildfires and hurricanes. Although, if I remember correctly, when we were in San Diego, there was a West Coast version of hurricane
Well, it's the
nearby as
remnants and
well.
the rain.
Yeah, we did
Yeah,
get a little bit
yeah.
of that, so I'm glad we could join together for a natural disaster somewhere else. All right, before
Oh,
we get started, a couple of things for folks joining us today. I have the Q&A open and the chat, so please do add your own questions as we go along, and we'll try to touch on those as we see them come in. Also, this is being recorded and will be posted to our GoDaddy Pro YouTube channel, and a link will be sent out to the email address that you registered. So if you have to hop out early or want to share this with your team later, you will have a link to the video. And with that, let's go on ahead and get into it. The first question is just to tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and your company, Accessicart.
yeah, yeah. So I come to working in WordPress community, WordPress world, and digital things as a second career. I started out as a nonprofit manager. So I worked in nonprofit management for about 15 years. And toward the end of that time, I was doing more and more techy geeky things, building websites and doing email newsletters and things like that. And then when my position got downsized right before the financial crisis in 2008, I kind of stumbled into freelancing and then grew that into an agency over the last, I'd say, for like 4 or 5 years. We've increasingly niched down on accessibility, web accessibility, and doing that. We had a client kind of, we didn't even really know too much about that until a client needed that. And in the last 6 months or so, we've become niched even further to focus more and more on web accessibility and e-commerce. And it's kind of exciting to be able to help people make their sites work for more people. So
Yeah, you I believe in your bio on the event or whatever, you have an agency as well, right? So you have
yeah,
sounded like you worked in nonprofit for a long time, then you started your agency, and then now you also have Accessicart as well. Is Accessicart
well,
a separate?
yeah, the agency kind of really became Accessicart,
Okay,
and yeah,
so it's
yeah,
niche down from, well, it's still client work, but specifically working
yeah,
on the accessibility part of that.
yes,
That's
yes,
awesome.
yes,
Um, just to kind of set a baseline for everyone joining us here, when we think of web accessibility, when we're talking about accessibility, it can be really general. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. What are we kind of talking about when we think about
yeah.
accessibility on the web?
Yeah, so web accessibility, when we talk about it in that kind of a term, it doesn't just mean being available, but it means being usable, workable for people who may have disabilities. And so that can also get very broad. It starts with, for instance, people who are blind may depend on something called a screen reader to read out loud, not just the text on the page, but other kinds of cues and codes and labels on the page for them. People who have a physical or a mobility issue and they can't use a mouse, like we might use a mouse, they depend on keyboard navigation and other kinds of adaptive devices. But web accessibility can begin to get very broad and cover things like ADHD, and reading disabilities. So, for instance, how you put text on the page can impact somebody's ability to kind of comprehend it. Um, Things like anxiety and depression can impact people getting through a process, like a checkout process. So it can't get very broad, but it really just means making your website universal, work for everybody, be universally available.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's so easy to see the word accessibility or think about accessibility, and it's just, cited, do I have the right contrast? Do I have the right font size or whatever? But it's so much more than that. Uh,
Yeah,
I didn't even think about it till now, like you said, some of the more emotional stuff, right, with depression and everything, all of that factors in. I don't know if it
yeah,
specifically falls under accessibility, but I think back to some of the things where Facebook would send out like a happy birthday to someone who was, deceased or whatever. And it's like, well, you kind of automated too far. There's some things that you have to be a little bit more
yeah,
sensitive to things,
yeah,
and
and
that maybe falls under some sort of functional accessibility more so than design accessibility. But yeah, it's so easy to think of
but
like the physical things and not even the emotional things right off the bat.
but even when people are beginning to think about that, I think one of the factors is people think it's a relatively small group of people. And really, when we start talking about all these things, CDC in the United States says that's 25% of all US adults. That's pretty consistent in other developed nations around the world, 20 to 25%. So that's quite a lot of people that you're, excluding if you're not making sure, some portion of those folks, if you're not making sure things are accessible. So,
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to consider. I mean, the numbers are so hard to think about, but 25%, which seems like, I mean, it's still a high percentage, but think about how many people that actually represents when you think of, billions of
well,
people.
yeah, and when you start talking about e-commerce, then you got to think about those people all have disposable in, it represents billions of dollars of disposable income. So
Right.
you're really kind of hurting yourself in your store by not really working to make sure those folks can use your site and actually check out and buy stuff.
Yeah, 100%. Let's get into some of that then. One of the
Yeah.
next questions that I have are there legal requirements to be accessible? So obviously it's important, but are there legal reasons why you might want to consider accessibility?
Absolutely. So there are some places where there are specific legal requirements that cover web accessibility. So places in Canada, places in EU, UK, some other places. Now they're not doing a lot of aggressive enforcement of those yet, but that's probably coming a little more. In the US, we're in a little bit different situation, and that is there's no kind of specific legal mandate around websites. And so what's happened is that people, because of that, people are filing lawsuits under the Americans with Disability Act. So Title III of the of ADA, which was written in 1990, and so it's definitely doesn't cover anything related to websites.
Yeah, for real.
But Title III has to do with public accommodations. So things like if you have a brick and mortar store, you have to make things accessible. You have to, provide a way for people in wheelchairs to get into your brick and mortar store. So people are being sued under that. And over the last 5 or 6 years, those lawsuits have gone up, fairly dramatically. Last in 2021, that's the last year we have them. There were, close to 4,000, and that 4,000 lawsuits. That does not count the number of people who got what's called a demand letter, and that's typically the first kind of sign that somebody intends to sue you. So you get this demand letter, and almost always what happens is that you're advised to settle, because even if you are accessible, you can get it can add up quite quickly if you're not accessible, even more. And so there's some legal and then therefore financial kinds of issues. But unfortunately, it's become kind of these extortative drive-by lawsuits where you'll have one plaintiff, one, typically a blind person, and one attorney, and they will sue hundreds and hundreds of website owners. And some of the courts are beginning to crack down on that a little bit, that practice a little bit.
Okay.
There are definitely legitimate folks in that mix too, right? And
Yeah,
legitimate
yeah.
in this. Well, it's not that that is not legitimate, but more specifically, a person who came to your site as a customer couldn't do something, and then is filing a suit. So yeah, it is important to try to avoid those lawsuits if you can.
Yeah, there's I, I hesitate to say unfortunately, but unfortunately, I guess businesses now being set up around tracking down sites that are inaccessible for one reason or another. And, you know, I
Yeah.
like the idea of that in terms of let's make the web accessible. But, when the intent is just to try and make a bunch of money, then that's where it gets a little slimy. You
Yeah, a lot
said,
of times
oh, yeah.
the plaintiff in those cases isn't even really intent, and that's where the courts are starting to go a little bit. Is that like, a blind plaintiff will sue a hotel or a boutique. Generally, the big box hotels have everything taken care of, like a smaller chain or
Hmm.
a smaller boutique hotel. But then the judge is saying, well, did you have a trip planned there? Were you actually planning to go there, or were you just surfing around for this suit? Um, so they're trying to start cracking down on that anyway. But
Yeah. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword because again, I mean, we want
again,
people to say, hey, your
yeah,
thing is inaccessible, whether it's a hotel or a website. Here's some things that you can do to make it accessible. That feels right. That feels good. But when the intent is to make a quick buck, then that's where it gets weird. You mentioned the demand letter. Is that similar, you would say, maybe to like a cease and desist if you're using like a copyrighted image on a site? Like, oh, we need you to take that
yeah, and
down.
the
You didn't
key,
get permission for that.
yeah, yeah. So you get a letter, it comes from an attorney, but the thing you need to know is that sometimes they look super spammy, just like those letters you get about, listing your domain in some direct, you have to read carefully. It looks like a domain renewal.
Hmm.
But so the key thing is just not to ignore it because even though we had a client get one time and I looked up the attorney and he'd been disbarred 3 times and,
Oh,
it was
geez.
just the whole thing just looked kind of cut and paste, not even real. But it was a legitimate demand letter, right? It came and the client's attorneys really, said you have to take this seriously. So, yeah, they can just be that. That would be typically a first step is that you would get a
Yeah,
demand letter.
that's good to know. I tend to toss those right in the garbage if they look spammy, like they're fishing for money or fishing for access or something. So good to know that I
Yep.
should definitely take those seriously and
Well,
at
give them a
least do
close read at least. But
yeah, at least do the due diligence to make sure that it's either spam or not spam.
yeah.
Um, so from there, I don't want to get sued, but are there other benefits to accessibility on the web?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, the benefits that you would get from making your site accessible, far lawsuits is just avoiding a lawsuit is just the beginning, right? So, the things that you'll do to make your website accessible, things like adding alt text to your images and proper semantic HTML structure, those are going to, vastly improve your SEO. So you will improve that sort of technical SEO pieces of doing that. If you're getting your site accessible, you're going to make your website easier for everybody to use. So when sometimes the curb cuts where people like the wheelchair curb cuts in the sidewalk,
Hmm.
um, we all get to benefit from those, right? When we're pulling a stroller or we're riding a bike or whatever, whatever it is. Same way, making websites accessible for people with disabilities makes it easier if you have people that have just sort of what we call a situational challenge. I'm out in the bright sunshine on my phone. If you've got good contrast, then I'm going to be able to use that easier.
Hmm.
If I have a wiggly baby, I'm doing this one-handed, right? All of those things are better in terms of UX when you're accessible. It's a great investment in your brand. I mean, if you want to be inclusive of people, who doesn't want that? I mean, so you can put, typically we encourage folks to put like an accessibility statement at the bottom of the website as just sort of you're not just saying we want everybody to be able to use the site. We've tried to do this, and an acknowledgement that, it's really impossible to be 100% accessible accessible. So it's always a work in progress. It's like SEO, right? You can always do better, right? At
Hmm.
SEO, you can always do better at accessibility. And so that's a piece of it. You can't anticipate every single type of disability or combination of disabilities. And so you just really have to put it out there, like, let us know if you have a problem.
Yeah.
And but it's a great investment in your brand that way. And then, it can be a great investment in your customers because we all are, as we age, disabilities go up, increase as we age, right? And so
Hmm.
I'm over 50 and I do this kind of, thing with the trying to read small print, all of those pieces. If you're accessible as your customers are aging, you'll get to keep them because they'll be able to continue using your website as opposed to having to go through the acquisition, you know, the cost of acquisition for new people to replace them. So,
Hmm.
so
Yeah, those
yeah,
are
that's,
that's a great point, and I really like the thing you said there for like agencies and developers. That tip there about having a message there on the site in the footer or wherever. It's like not
yeah.
only is it good for your brand, but it says, hey, we're making an effort here, but we want to hear if something's not working, right? Don't We're not looking for you to blast us on Twitter or come after us with an attorney. We want you to contact us and let us know if there's
Well,
somewhere on our site
yeah.
that we could improve.
Right. There's no guarantee that keeps you
Sure,
away from a demand letter, but it certainly puts you out there in a much more kind of open way. And you do have to I mean, then you have to make sure it's an email that works and
of
somebody
course.
gets that email or
Yeah.
whatever, but replies to it. But and it may be that you can't do it for this particular, make it accessible if a person has, um, a particular combination of disabilities that make it difficult for them. So it's not that you would have to do that for everybody, but there are ways that then, you may be able, if somebody reaches out to you, you can't make the website accessible to them that way. There are, they ways that they can call. You could provide a way for them to call in or to,
Hmm.
do something by phone. But it's, the whole key is that you have to make some kind of an equal experience, right, for the persons with disabilities.
Yeah, that's a good point too with the offline ability to kind of handle some of that too. It's,
There are, I mean, if people are particularly worried about it, that's one way that some people have tried to kind of deal with that liability issue is provide a 24/7 support line that call us.
hmm.
And that gets expensive. uh, and it may there are some cases where people have tried to argue that's not an equal experience, but it just depends on what your site is and what you're selling, what you're promoting. So
Right.
yeah.
I don't know this from experience, but I would imagine that most of the people who have some sort of accessibility issue that aren't headhunting sites to sue are going to be willing to work with you in whatever efforts that you're making. And so as long as you're making an effort, I think that that's a great step in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, most people with disabilities aren't interested in like taking you to court. What they
Right.
really want is you just to make their site accessible, right?
Right. They just want to, I mean, and we'll talk about this in a second with commerce, but they ultimately just want to give you money. So why make it difficult to
Exactly,
for them
exactly.
to pay you for your products or services, right?
Right, exactly.
Um,
Uh,
so we talked, I mean, mentioned your company Accessicart, but I want to dig in a little bit on the cart side of that. So what made you want to
yeah.
focus on e-commerce accessibility?
Ah. Well, traditionally, like when I say traditionally, like over the last 20 years or more, as the web accessibility has been a thing, been out there for that long. But typically, those projects for web accessibility have been either government or higher education sites. So those are the two places where there was both a mandate and money to make those happen. And on the other hand, we're a small agency, and so unless we partner with bigger agency, and those two niches really look to bigger agencies to, and they typically have bigger projects, and they want
Hmm.
to see a deep bench to fulfill all of that. And I get that. And we looked at partnering with bigger agencies, and we certainly do some of that kind of work alongside bigger agencies, helping them with accessibility pieces. But as we began to look around about that, last year, 2021,
Hmm.
um, of all the ADA lawsuits that were filed, 74% of them were e-commerce websites.
Hmm.
And I realized, oh, nobody is specifically serving that particular niche, and that is a place where people are having some risk and liability. They need some
Yeah,
help, and we could, we had some experience with e-commerce, and we could bring that to bear. And so it's kind of a hopeful, thing to be able to help site owners, no matter what their site size. We can work with them and help make them more accessible. So
that makes sense. You
yeah,
said 74%. That's extremely high.
yeah. That's very high. Of all the lawsuits last year were e-commerce websites. Now, and they're not all the big ones, right? So,
Hmm.
so bigger e-commerce sites, the more brand name one, Nike and, bigger sites, Amazon, they tend to have big internal teams dedicated to accessibility. They are on top of that. That's not to say people don't try to sue
Sure.
higher revenue sites, but a lot of those lawsuits were more mid-range revenue sites. They're not super, super high. They're looking, somewhere in the, million to $10 million in revenue size. So it's something that people do need to take seriously, even if they feel like they're a smaller site.
Yeah, I imagine that those larger companies that you mentioned, they probably understand that, again, it's money left on the table, so they need to be on
Well,
top of
there's
it.
that, but they were some of the first recipients of the lawsuits, right?
Right.
So people started suing the deep pockets first,
Sure.
and everybody looked around and went, "Oh, we got to fix that before we get hit," right? And
Right.
so they have the resources, but also the motivation to do that. But you're right. It's also let's close down that loss of revenue.
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of math behind it, where we have to pay so much for folks to be on payroll to deal with this, but it's less than one, getting sued, two, leaving money on the table. So it makes
Yeah,
100% sense to do that.
like the average settlement for even a small suit starts at around, $30,000 and can go way up from there because you typically, especially, I mean, when you lose, and most of the time the site owner loses, not always, but most of the time, you're paying your attorney's fees, the plaintiff's attorney's fees, then you're having to remediate the website, and you're often having to remediate the website because the court has said it must be done within this tight time frame, so you're having to pay a premium to get it done quickly.
Yep. Or
and
take people
and
away from other tasks and stuff. Yeah, that
Yep,
totally makes
yeah.
sense.
So it can be quite a large sum. So
Yeah. So speaking of just accessibility around e-commerce sites, for folks that have their own e-commerce sites, where do e-commerce sites generally have accessibility issues? Where should people who are running e-commerce sites or building e-commerce sites for clients be focusing a lot of their
yep.
attention?
Well, one place that is a an interesting place that people may not think about is the alt text on product photos. So if you have, and if it's going to be a site manager that's going to be creating new products and uploading new photos, they really need to take some time to get trained around how to write good alt text. So our Meg Miller from our Accessicart team is going to be doing a meetup in a couple months, and we've been talking about this internally on the team, right? So you may have a couch, and you need to describe it needs to not just say orange couch, or it needs to give specific information about that product that the consumer or the potential customer is looking for, right? Does it have space underneath it that where the cats can get underneath? Does it have, right? Does it have, what's the material? All of those kinds of things can be in the alt text, and then the alt text for every single angle there should to tell about what's different, right? Does it have some feature that you can't see in the other photo, but now you can see in this one. So being sure that you're working out and providing great alt text on the images. You want to make sure, and maybe I should say, when I say great, I mean even more detailed and helpful, right?
Hmm.
But you have to think about it from the perspective as the customer, and that's a little different than just general alt text on a page. You definitely want to make sure, in the same way that you would on a regular page, that you're putting in your H tag structure properly. And because people who use screen readers are typically surfing through, just like us sighted people, they're surfing through just reading out the headings in the screen reader, right? So you want
Hmm.
to be careful about putting things in there. If you have, where the section of testimonials is, or where the section of, product specs is, or what those things are, so that you're getting them in there properly. But by and large, I mean, one huge place where lots and lots of e-commerce sites have problems is the checkout, the cart and the checkout.
Yeah.
And so um, WooCommerce on its own is fairly accessible for the most part,
Hmm.
on the front end of the website. Um, it When you start putting additional plugins on the back end with WooCommerce, anything that is outputting can affect accessibility, and unfortunately, that's the case for a lot of cart and check-in things. So you would want to, and the theme that you're in can also affect that. So you would want to, put something in the cart and then go to the page. And what we see often is that the flow is not right. So when you hit the tab key. People who are navigating by keyboard are typically just hitting the tab key, tab and
Hmm.
enter, maybe the space bar to check boxes. So you just start hitting the tab key, and you should be moving through the checkout form to every space. Um, you should uh, that should be in a logical, consistent piece, and you want to think about user experience as you're doing that. So, like we did an audit on a Shopify site last month, where the Shopify that has the kind of two column checkout, you
Hmm.
go through all of your billing stuff at shipping stuff or billing stuff first.
Hmm.
And when you hit that tab key, it takes you down. There's a button that says go on to billing. If you keep hitting the tab key, it goes down into the footer to the privacy policy. And then you go over to the other column to get to the coupon field. So a blind person might never know that there's a coupon field over there.
Yeah.
So
That is
things
interesting
like
that it didn't
that you want to make sure. So
go
you
from one
you want to
column
make
to the
sure
other.
that they're moving through the field in a kind of a logical order. But also, the other thing that often is missing is what's called a focus indicator. So every time you're going through and there's an input field, or something that you could click or put an input in, there should be an outline of some kind that is very clear and visible, right?
Yeah.
It's called a focus indicator.
That's one that's commonly CSS'd out by people. And don't do that. That's there for a reason.
People who are it will never appear unless someone is trying to do keyboard navigation. So why would you hamstring people with disabilities in it when it's not going to appear for anybody? A user that's using the key a mouse, and like me, right? I'm never going to see that. So you want to make sure you definitely have that focus indicator, um, as well as moving through the form and kind of thinking about the user experience moving through the form. But try to check out on your page using only your keyboard and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Change the quantity. Can you change the quantity?
It makes me wonder how often a designer developer unintentionally does something to the site that reduces accessibility rather than making it better, and even
All the
worse
time.
when it's built into themes and you don't even, as a developer or site builder, you're not even thinking about it because the theme developer decided to do something that's going to hamper accessibility.
Yeah. Removing skip links is another thing that theme developers often do.
Yeah,
Skip
that's
skip links are when you go to the page, and you first hit the tab key. There should be, usually it's up in the left hand corner, sometimes in the middle of the page, something that appears that says skip to content. And
hmm
if you hit return on that, it takes you down to the content area. And what that does is it lets, like, if I've been on the home page and now I've gone to a product page on your site, I don't want to have to tab through your ginormous menu again for everything, right? I just want
Yeah.
to skip down to the content. And so you're taking those out. And again, it's something that sighted or non-disabled users never see. I don't know why you would take it out, but
Yeah. And that's generally, in any of the like WordPress default themes. But when you build your own theme or grab a theme from somewhere that maybe stripped out of it in the template or whatever. And I've had that even worse is if you're on a screen, like you can tab through, but if you're on a screen reader, you're having to listen to the entire 50 item navigation menu again each time you go to another page.
yes. Yeah, and it can be. But I think uh, we are having, for instance, more presentations at meetups and WordCamps, and so people are starting to pay attention to it more. And that's my hope, is that talks like this, or conversations like this, where you really start to get some awareness, even if you're still at a real basic level, that you can just start paying attention to things and notice when things are missing that should be there, and try to alert folks or find a way to get it fixed. So
Yeah, and you mentioned just a little bit ago that you had someone that was going to do a webinar coming up. I want to make sure that we get
yeah,
a link
yeah.
to that into our show notes as well so people can register.
Okay, I think it's not coming out until next week. It's she's doing it
That's
for
fine.
an online meetup for a WordPress group. So
Yeah, that's great. I just want to
awesome.
point people in that direction, make sure that they have a link to that
Yep,
as well.
sure.
Talked a little bit already about WooCommerce's accessibility on its own. Are there any particular plugins that you've seen that have maybe made WooCommerce's accessibility either better or worse? And one example
Mm,
that comes to mind is like digital downloads. Are there some requirements around digital downloads inside WooCommerce or any e-commerce
yeah,
as well?
yeah. So I don't want to name names because I think that kind of
That's fine. I mean, not
isn't
necessarily
necessarily, but
names as maybe some different functionality that people need to
yeah, yeah.
like.
Things that modify the cart are
Okay.
especially hard. Yep. Things that are doing any kind of search or filtering, that's also a piece. Anything that has a date picker in it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So some of those kinds of pieces are functionalities that are just hard in WordPress. Anything that has a table layout. So if you've got a table that's showing your cart, sometimes the table has to be properly formatted with the right headers and
Okay.
row labels. So those are the kinds of things that you would want to watch out for. And partly I don't want to name names because my hope is that we will be working with some of these plugins
Sure.
to
No,
help
I
them
meant
improve. And we're starting to
functionality
have
in
some of
general,
those
anyways.
conversations, but those functionalities in particular, yeah. So yeah, all of those things that I named uh, are all things. But and if you are coming across things that are kind of similar in that sort of vein, yeah, it's a good thing to test and check. And and that's a thing, where you can sometimes, we encounter folks that don't, even very experienced developers who have an idea of what accessibility is supposed to do, but then aren't sure, did we get it fixed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you can reach out to other people like Accessicar, or there are some other agencies out there doing accessibility. We're not the only one. That reach out to folks. There's an accessibility WordPress accessibility meetup, and they have a Facebook group that is very active about answering questions and looking at things. So there's some great resources out there for people to begin to look at some of those things. But in terms of digital downloads, one important thing to know is that PDFs. So typically an ebook might be a PDF. People might be selling PDF reports or white papers or stuff like that. Um, PDFs and Word docs, digital documents, have some of the same requirements for web accessibility as websites do. So you have to have your proper H structure. You have to have alt text on your images. You have to have, if there are graphs and charts, you have to have descriptive text. If there, I mean, all of those pieces. If it's a long document, it needs to have a table of contents that actually goes to each section, right? So you have that
Hmm.
like clickable table of contents at the top. So all of those pieces, and a lot of times people are not aware that PDFs have to be that way. So in terms of the accessibility of PDFs, I would say if you can avoid putting things into a PDF and just put it on the page,
Hmm.
you're far better off, and it's far easier to make that accessible. Um, we're currently working with a large nonprofit where they have 10 years of
Oof.
inaccessible PDFs on their website,
Oh man.
and so then we've had to be sorting them through. Now, some of them are like, the annual report from 2009 and the tax return,
Yeah.
public transparency tax returns, da, da, da. And those are like, well, we're recommending for the older documents in terms of remediating those. Let's just put a little thing on here that says, um, if you need an accessible copy of this document, please contact us.
Yeah.
And so you're not having to worry about trying to remediate all that. But for things that are really critical to their core mission, brochures, more current reports and pieces that people are still using a lot, we are remediating those by taking that content out of the PDF, putting it on a page, and
Hmm.
then leaving a link to the inaccessible PDF. But it's that all of that information now is then on a page, including things like building out the charts, putting the charts and graphs in with these big descriptive things, and building out a JavaScript flow chart for, if you were discriminated against and lost your job, this is your flow chart of what you need to do. So yeah, it can get pretty complicated with some of
Hmm.
that.
Again, though, I'd argue that in addition to just being accessible and avoiding lawsuits and all of that, helps with SEO and search engines because you've got, that content is
Absolutely.
available for search engines to find, and that brings more visitors and more eyeballs to the site too.
Exactly, exactly. It is. And if you're talking about an LMS, which is kind of a different, I mean, it's not quite e-commerce, but it's certainly there. I would say you want to make sure that when you're doing the LMS, that you really do focus on things that are embedded in the page,
Hmm.
right? So rather than trying to just make a PDF that somebody's going to read. And when you do that, you have to think about if you're putting in any videos, they
Yep.
need to have either closed caption on them, which you can do. So like, for instance, when you go to upload this video to YouTube, you can turn on a tool that will give it, automated captions if
Yeah.
needed, but
Well.
then also a transcript,
Hmm.
right? And it's not perfect, but it's a start, right? And so the more mission critical the video is, the more you need to kind of, publish the transcript, like a lot of podcasts folks do now. They've got the video or audio of their show, and then there's the transcript that's below, which also helps with SEO, right?
Right,
It's
more
you get
content for the
all
site.
of that.
No,
Yeah.
I will make sure, since we weren't able to get the captions going on the live transcription going on this, I will make sure that this is captioned when it gets
Well,
uploaded.
yeah, a lot of people don't realize you can do that. I mean, that's a tool that you could do with
Hmm.
YouTube or some of the other providers, and it is important to do it even every time, because studies show that 80% of the people who watch videos on social media have no hearing impairment. Who watch videos with the sound off have no
Hmm.
hearing impairment. So I do this all the time. I'm up early reading the news. Other people in my household are still asleep. I'm watching your video with the captions and no
Yeah,
playing no sound.
as do I. I do that all the time, and I appreciate the captions being there.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
Yeah.
all right. Let's continue to talk plugins for just a moment. There are plugins that say they can fix accessibility issues for me. Can I just rely on those? And what should I look for in a plugin that claims to help with my accessibility?
Okay. So there are a couple different types of accessibility plugins. One of them is called an overlay. And what it does is it uses JavaScript and some AI to try and fix on the fly your accessibility issues. So the important thing to know is that AI, and this would include like any kind of testing tools too that are they're using that same AI. Um, they only find about 30% of accessibility issues. So a tool like that, the AI can find out whether your color contrast is off. It can find out whether your H tag structure is not, properly nested. It can tell you whether you have an alt text, whether one is missing or not, but it can't tell you whether it's a good alt text.
Hmm.
But it can't tell you whether you can keyboard navigate your website, or whether you have focus indicators, or there's a lot of other pieces. So only about 30% of issues can you find with AI. So first of all, those overlay plugins are only going to find some of the issues.
Hmm.
Typically, they put a little widget down in the corner, and it's to give accessibility tools. And what you need to know is that if a person is disabled and needs a particular tool, they already have that installed on their machine because they need it for the other 99% of
Yeah.
websites that don't have that little thing. And the little tool in the overlay that you just installed often, very often, conflicts with the tool that is their native tool and
Oh,
lets
good.
neither of them work. And so those many people with disabilities install a browser extension or to block those kind of overlay plugins. So that should tell you something right there, that the
Yeah.
people you're trying to help are blocking your tool, and or to block the services at the at the router level, just so they don't
Hmm.
have to deal with them. Um, there is also some concern because those so typical overlay plugins that you might have heard of are ones like Audio Eye and Accessibility and Userway, and you're hearing a lot from them because they've received huge venture capital investments and they're just advertising everywhere.
Hmm.
There are growing concerns that there are privacy issues from those plugins because once a user, when you open up the little dialogue,
Mm.
the user has to say, give them protected information about my health status and disabilities, right? I have seizure inducing
Yeah.
disability, or I have this. And there's evidence that those services, so Accessibility or User or whoever, are storing that information on their server so that the next time that user goes to another site with the plugin on it, it's already selected. So that will get you in some privacy hot
Yeah.
water,
Which
I'm pretty
sounds like a
sure.
convenience, but is actually just a privacy concern masked as a convenience.
Yeah. And there's some evidence that because those predatory lawsuit people know that the overlay plugins are not, can't fix everything, that they're actually starting to target the users of these overlay plugins. So they can run, these scripts that help you figure out which sites are running that plugin and target those sites. So just be aware, it's not going to keep you. There's a great website that explains much more of this in detail called overlayfactsheet.com, and
Okay.
it's got much more detailed information about overlays. That's one type of plugin. There is another type of plugin that is really using the AI to assist content creators in kind of reminding them about putting in accessible content. Because anytime you make changes to the site, um, you're getting a chance to mess up the accessibility, right? And so one of them is called Accessibility Checker. There's a free level of that in the uh, repository, and then
Hmm.
there's Accessibility Checker Pro is a paid version. This is put out by our friends at Equalize Digital.
Yep.
And what it does is it sits in there, and anytime you update a page or a post, and I products too, I think custom post types, it will give you a little alert about things that are not meeting accessibility standards that you've put in. So, it's a very handy tool for doing that kind of stuff. And there are some other things to do some testing around that, accessibility, um, and kind of run those tests on things that you've already edited. Typically, those are the premium levels of those plugins. But you're always able to override that. And this is the clients that who have accessibility requirements that we've installed this plugin for. This is the problem: is their content creators will sometimes say, "It says you're missing an alt text." Oh well, I'm in a hurry. I'm going to ignore that, right? And
Yeah.
so you have to use the tool, right?
Yeah.
But
Don't have the tool and then ignore it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the plugins
But
kind of fall into two different categories. One is the we'll do it for you category. The other one is the we'll let you know where you're falling short category. And it sounds
Yep.
like leaning towards the one that lets you know where you can better your site yourself is the way to go. Again, I didn't even realize
Well,
that there were the like extensions and stuff for folks to turn off the accessibility helper, that the
yep,
one that's doing it for you, which then gets you right back to where you started, which is an accessible website. So the more that you can do yourself
yep.
and not rely on something to try and do it for you, I think this sounds like the better off you'll be. And it's only going to catch,
Well, I
like you said,
totally
30% of it anyways.
But I totally get the desire to, I mean, accessibility can be complex. And I totally get the desire to have like an easy button to make it just one and done. And I think it is important to be aware that those overlay plugins are forming white label partnerships with a lot of agencies. And so that's a thing now too, is they're, you know, providing an incentive for a lot of agencies to just sort of sell these overlay plugins and call it accessible. And that's a way to get yourself sued, I think, eventually. But
Yeah, a little dangerous. I mean, certainly a way to get yourself sued, but also I imagine that some of those will have the opposite effect for some of the other things that you're trying to account, like the SEO and the layout and making things
yeah,
just
exactly. You
better
don't
overall.
get
Now
the other
you're
benefits, right?
right, you're
Yeah,
losing, not only losing out, but maybe counteracting some of the other benefits, which is not helpful.
right.
Um, we
Yeah,
have a few minutes still. Let's talk about specifically agencies, developers, freelancers that are working on sites for others. Sounds like there may be an added cost to web accessibility. Is it expensive to make a site accessibility, and what can agencies and freelancers do to kind of build that cost maybe into
yep.
their quotes, their proposals?
Yep. So one of the things is that when you're doing either a redesign or redevelopment or a new site development, new project, the most cost-effective way to deal with web accessibility is to start at the beginning, to at the very beginning of the project, to start thinking about accessibility. The most expensive way to deal with it is to wait until the end and then sort of
Yeah,
tack it on. Like,
add an accessibility layer doesn't really work.
no, because if you've got a problem with you built out a functionality of one sort or another, but you've used an inaccessible plugin, but now it's all built out, that's expensive. If you used a color scheme that isn't giving you good color contrast,
Hmm.
now you've got to go back and fix that. It can get really expensive really quickly. I would say um, that's one thing, is to understand that you need to start at the beginning. A lot of times, accessibility is not you know, it can seem really complex and confusing, but I think once people have been through the process and understand more about what it entails, it just needs to become part of what you do. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was when you start to do web accessibility, don't add it as a option for the client to refuse.
Hmm.
You put it in as something that you're going to do because you don't want to throw people with disabilities under the bus, or say, well, for cheaper I'll let your website exclude people.
Yeah,
you know it's kind of like not a great look, right?
that's, yeah,
so
red flag as an
so
agency, really.
yeah, so one of the things is to begin to educate yourself, and everybody starts somewhere. Start doing start writing some of these things into your QA, or some of train your people to always look for color contrast. There are great tools in Figma and AI and other design tools. Start somewhere. Start with the design. Start with the content people. Get them trained how to do this, and it'll just become second nature to them. That's a piece of that going forward. There are Accessicart, but other agencies too have partnered with other developers and agencies, freelancers and agencies, to sort of walk through, do some consulting, to walk them through. And what I find is, when we do that, it's usually 3 or 4 projects, and then they don't need us anymore. They figured it out. They know what, or maybe they'll call us when it's an unusual thing they haven't, encountered before. But typically we might come in at the very beginning to talk about features and what you might want to watch out for in terms of feature development kinds of things. We might come in at color um, color scheme decisions, mock-ups, and then somewhere along the line, as questions arise in terms of the build out, and then maybe at the end a little bit for do some checking. But once we've done that like 3 or 4 times, people, they get it. And like I said, we're not the only people who do that, and that can be a great way to kind of it is a lot of um, sometimes it feels like a lot of things, right? And then once you start doing the practical applications, it's not as complicated as it seems, I think so.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my final question, was just for agencies and developers that don't have a lot of expertise, how they can get some help there.
Yeah.
Access-a-Cart, obviously a great option. It sounds like workflow wise, you sort of work through entire projects with a client from beginning to end, kind of
We can. Yeah,
help
we
all the
can.
way
And we're
throughout.
doing, we're still doing full site development too and other kinds of things, but we do that consulting. Other places that developers and agencies can get help and learn. The WordPress Accessibility Meetup meets twice a month, once in the morning, once in the evening, and there are some great presentations there that will help you learn more about accessibility, and a whole archive of the past presentations where you can look up find things that are more topically, immediate need learn for you, right?
Hmm.
But some of the best accessibility people around that have been making presentations there for a couple years now, and so you can find some great help there. The Facebook group for the WordPress accessibility group is there, and very willing to, got a lot of people that are willing to kind of help with folks. If you want to send people for training. One place is DQ, DEQUE,
Okay.
DQ.com. Now they actually are primarily a services business, but they have a whole section on online learning, and you can do on-demand courses, starting with one that's really not super technical, but really introduces you to the world of disability, types of
Right.
disabilities and the types of accommodations that they need. We require all of our people to go through that, and then there are individual courses for that are get more technical about how to implement accessibility, and those can be really great too. Some other places that you can find online courses that you can buy that will do some accessibility training too. So
Yeah,
all kinds of ways to do that.
I'd offer that maybe that even real 101 DQ course would be a great intro for clients if you're looking to
Yeah.
convince clients that this is absolutely
Well,
necessary,
it's a little
giving,
dry, but
well,
I wish it were a little
well, maybe someone wants to watch it and
sexier, but
create a
no,
more
yeah, yeah,
exciting
yeah.
version.
And the other piece out there is we have, and I'm we have worked with a few agencies and developers where, for whatever reason, they simply wanted to outsource projects that involved a high level of accessibility. And I would say, and some of that is people didn't feel confident in their own skills, or they didn't want to take on learning those pieces, and that's okay too. But another piece of that is that um, you can find folks that will do that and then hand the site back to you to do the ongoing work. So I would say the one thing that we haven't talked about that might people may want to do is on I'll see if I can find the link for you. There's a release of liability. Anytime you're doing work around accessibility for clients, you should be putting into your contracts a release of liability specifically around accessibility, because accessibility, the the standards and the practices implementations around accessibility are changed rapidly.
hmm
The legal situation is ambiguous, and anytime anything updates on the website, there's a potential for things to fall out of compliance. You can't guarantee anytime a plugin updates, anytime somebody changes the content, potential for things to go out of compliance. So there's really, you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself in those situations. So
Yeah, that's super great advice that I hope everyone heard and will immediately add into their contracts because that's so important.
yeah, and
Yep.
I have one more little piece of advice for folks, and that is there is you to sell accessibility to people, to clients, there is a tax credit that's available. So it is a holdover from the old ADA days when people needed to put in ramps and guard, handrails in the bathrooms and all of that. Um, as a site owner, you can get up to 50% tax credit for anything that you do that increases the accessibility of your website. So whether that's an audit, remediations, a new site build that includes accessibility as one of its goals, up to $10,000, you can get in a tax credit. So that's not, you don't get money back, but you get your tax bill reduced. And there's some information about that on our website. You can
Yeah, that's
simper through. But
awesome.
that's a great way to kind of start selling accessibility too. So
Yeah, absolutely. Before you just go giving away all of your Accessicart services for free here, where can people find out more about what Accessicart does and how they can help and contact you and learn more and all that? Where can people find
yeah,
you?
yeah. So we're at accessicart.com. And you can find some info out there. We have um, everything from audits and remediation, but we especially do a mini audit of your checkout field. We talked a lot about how the checkout can be, but we do a focused mini audit of the checkout field, and that's a great place that a lot of people like to start. And then you can find me on Twitter. We are on Twitter at Accessicart, but then I'm on Twitter at Beth Hannon, and DMs are open. Just shoot me a DM or um, uh, contact us through the contact form on the website. Happy to talk to folks.
Awesome. Easy enough. I will make sure that all of the links that we talked about go into the notes here. They'll be underneath
Awesome.
the YouTube video. They'll be on the event page. They'll be in the email that gets sent out. I also want to plug real quick, WordPress Accessibility Day is happening on November 2nd and 3rd. It's a 24-hour virtual conference. I'll add the link there for people that want to go ahead and register and help with WordPress accessibility there as well.
And it's free.
And it's
It's a
free.
free event. It's a free event. Sponsors like GoDaddy
Thanks
have
for the plug.
helped us to make it free. Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I will make sure that all of that ends up in there. I will also make sure that this video, when it gets uploaded, is captioned as well, especially since we were unable to figure out the live captioning, but I will work on figuring that out as well. So future meetups have live captioning enabled. I will make sure to
That's
make that a
awesome.
priority. Um, that's it for us for this week. For this and any other future events, head to events.godaddy.com. We do have one event next Wednesday already up there for folks to register, talking all about the query loop block inside of WordPress. Our friend Bud Kraus from Joy of WP will be joining me to talk about the query loop block. So make sure you go register for that next week, and catch any of our past event replays there as well. That's it for us today. Thanks again, Bet, for hanging out and talking accessibility with us.
Awesome to hang out with you, Marcus.
All right. Thanks again. See you next time.